Why do rich cities rebel? In a recent article, American economist Jeffrey Sachs argues that a sense of unfairness mixed with perceived low social mobility can trigger massive social unrest, particularly in rich cities. In the cases of protests in Hong Kong, Paris and Santiago in Chile, the author says the government's lost touch with the public sentiment and underestimated how a seemingly small policy change could trigger rebellion. How true is the argument, and does the report help make sense out of the situation like Hong Kong? I have Qiang, Assistant Director at the International Monetary Institute of Renmin University of China, and from Philadelphia, the U.S., Blackburn-Dwyer, President of the consulting firm Grasshopper Strategies. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. So, Professor Sachs' article says in the cases of all three of these affluent cities, officials fail to anticipate the chaos that would erupt from what seemed like a minor change, for instance, a few tax increase, a fugitive transfer bill, and higher metro prices, respectively. He also said that when you look at the traditional metric of GDP per capita, all three cities are actually paragons of economic success, but that alone isn't enough to measure the residents' level of satisfaction. Other factors, such as the public's subjective sense of fairness, freedom to make life choices, the government's honesty, and the perceived trustworthiness of fellow citizens also matter. So, Brandon, what do you make of the argument in this article? Are they convincing in a way to measure the city's satisfaction, for instance?
At the core, Jeffrey Sachs' conclusions, I think, do hold a lot of water, hold a lot of merit. What he really isolates is that the traditional measure of wealth has been GDP. That's what we measure the wealth of cities, of states, of nations, of regions of the world, of developing economies versus developed. We look at the number of GDP. GDP, though, is a number we've been using for 80 years, and it really doesn't reflect the modern globalized economy, particularly when you start trying to make assumptions out of GDP by dividing it by the number of people in a certain population. That's what we call GDP per capita. When you have places like, say, New York City, where a huge portion of the GDP comes from the stock market, and an immense amount of the United States' wealth is concentrated because the stock market happens to be in New York City, that has absolutely no relationship to the 8 million people that live in New York City proper. So dividing that GDP by the population of New York tells you literally nothing about how wealthy or how powerful the actual individuals are. And when you look at that on a global scale, you have numbers that look wildly inaccurate because you're assuming that these people then have that percentage of the economy in their pocket. And the reality is the top 1% of Chile owns 33% of the economy. So that alone tells you that the rest of the people don't own very much individually.
All right, Qiang, what is your take on the same arguments? And by the way, we're not just talking about GDP versus happiness. We're also talking about, for instance, officials' inability to anticipate public sentiments, for instance, for a seemingly small policy change. What are your overall reaction to this article?
Well, Lucian, do you know what's the real happiness for a human being?
Well, I don't know.
If you are,
that's why I'm trying. That's why I'm working.
I don't want to go to the philosophy or the religion, but
according
to the study of the science, if you are familiar with theory of Qiang or the Adler, the psychologist, they will tell you you must have a purpose with a rightful purpose, and then you will feel the proper happiness of your own.
Now I understand why I'm rather happy, because I have a good job that I'm passionate about.
That's true.
Go ahead.
So I totally agree that the GDP is a rather obsolete target to measure the people's happiness. It's not. Basically, you see in the rich cities like Hong Kong or like Santiago or like a lot of places like Paris, you know, their GDP per capita or their GDP absolute is absolutely the highest among the whole world. But people are not happy. Why? Because a lot of grassroots people, they're living like 30 years or 50 years of working, and their salary cannot afford even the smallest unit of the housing. So they lose the purpose, you know, as a human being. So they cannot see the hope. That's the reason why they feel that it's not fair, even though their absolute earning is probably the highest in the whole world.
Do you think there are comparability, Brandon, among these three cities? Because after all, the cases why they erupted were different, right? Paris over fuel tax. San Diego was metro fare. For Hong Kong, it's also slightly different. The case was not so small, and it had much more of a political agenda to it. So do you think it is fair to bundle these three cities together? And also, you know, you mentioned the city of New York, where the inequality is huge, and yet we are not seeing anything happening, at least not yet. I'm sorry if I, you know, but let's not go in there. But, you know, my example is understood.
Well, no, but let's not forget that New York City was the site of the Occupy Wall Street movement just 8-10 years ago, which is largely fueled by similar types of fears of inequality and lack of social mobility. But when you're talking about the three cities in question under Jeffrey Sachs' article, you're talking about Chile and Paris. Those two, I think, have a lot in common. They were both about transit costs for average citizens. You're talking about a fuel tax that hits regressively people that cannot afford to live downtown Paris, who then have to travel and now spend more on that travel when they already have less money than the people that can afford to live downtown. Chile, the same thing. You have people traveling at least 2 hours on average, now having to spend more on that transit to go to a job that doesn't pay them enough to actually live anywhere near where they work. Those two are regressive taxes that hit the lower income earners in the economy. Hong Kong, I think there's a lot more to it. The extradition bill is really about politics. It's really about social constructs and how the mainland and Hong Kong get along and cultural divides that have been brewing for years. I don't think that should have been brought into Jeffrey Sachs' article. I think if he wanted to add another economic argument, he could have added Venezuela or Haiti or a lot of other areas that are seeing economic-based protests around corruption.
But, Qiang, do you agree with that? I mean, in terms of economic inequality, I think there is a lot of similarity in that case, right?
Well, I agree with it, but I think there's more to add to it. And we have to understand, first of all, the human being does not progress in the past 1,000 years. We're still the same human being. Just imagine the breakup of the First World War. You know, it still happens the same way. You know, young people who lost their job and all resentful and not satisfying, and he killed the Archduke of the Ferdinand and triggered the whole World War. The whole World War has not happened within any major countries, but with the young people triggered the whole war. And now, if you go to the modern world, you will find out, yes, unfairness, the basic sense among the human being. And when this consensus reaches as largest number of the grassroots as you can reach, and then you break out suddenly without any predicators. And also, the social media make everything to be so contagious, so it makes it even harder to predict.
Yeah, well, I think there's a very important word that was used in Mr. Sachs's article, which is perceived. You know, he was not talking about unfairness per se. He was talking about a sense of unfairness. He was not talking about low social mobility per se. He was talking about perceived low social mobility. Why is he using such words, Brandon? And do you agree that it is about the perception of people, it is about the feeling of people, their level of satisfaction, rather than what really has landed in their pockets?
Well, if we're going to talk philosophy, we are animals driven by our animal spirits, and as such, it is how we feel and how we perceive things that really drives most human engagement and action, and particularly anger. If we were a world full of completely and utterly rational actors that literally sat down at the end of each day and added everything up and said, well, actually, you know what, I should be happy because I have $12 in my bank account and somebody in another country only has $2 in my bank account, that makes me feel great. We would live in a different world. We would have a very different community. We wouldn't have as much art. We wouldn't have as much fun. Because the reality is our perception of our world shapes our emotional response. And so if we perceive inequality, if we see that we see others achieving where we feel that we cannot, when we see unfairness and seeing our cost of living rising while others, per se, the rich, their cost of living going down with cutting taxes and things like that, we are going to perceive a large sense of inequality, and that's going to drive a sense of anger. The reason Jeffrey Sachs uses perceive is because if we truly just did a mathematical equation and compared people in Paris versus people in Chile, we'd say, well, why is anyone in Paris complaining? They overall have a better GDP per capita.
They are French.
They should just be happy inherently, ignoring any of ignoring any of the human interaction or actual realities on the ground for people that are struggling day by day to actually make ends meet, even if their overall economy looks more wealthy.
I meant that as a joke, okay? I didn't mean that as a serious comment, so don't hold me accountable.
No worries. Hey, the French like to protest as well. There's a tradition of protesting in France. There really is. I mean, we can't ignore that history of it.
No more comment on that. But Qiang, in the case of Hong Kong, exactly, is it reality versus impression or reality versus reality we're talking about here?
Well, I can follow up with our Brandon's. It's just a comment. Well, I agree his point, but I don't think it's out of the animal spirit, but I think it's out of the human being spirit. You know, people will fall into chaotic situation and riot out of two kinds of reasons. First of all, it's about the true reality, as we mentioned, like in the city of San Diego. People really spend a lot of time traveling, and they're struggling with each penny in their pocket. But that is out of the poverty. But if we follow that logic, I think probably the most chaotic places or rioting places should be in Africa. But we don't see that kind of situation in Africa because African people is working very hard to earn their happiness. The situation in Hong Kong is actually not out of the animal spirit, it's out of the human being spirit. Why people get angry as a human being? Jealous, unsatisfying. People are feeling the sense of not good, that there's somebody is richer. Just look at these rioters in Hong Kong. They're using the iPhones to do the, the video streaming. They're doing all kinds of fancy, stunning things with their fancy equipment, the cameras. So they're having the good income. They're probably having the best living standard in the whole world. The reason why they're angry is mostly because they're not livable or they're surviving and struggling, but because they're thinking somebody is holding a fancier iPhone or better laptop or larger house. So that's the reason why they're unsatisfying.
Okay, your opinion there. Very briefly, Brendan, do you agree with that? I mean, I know, yes, these people might be using an iPhone, but iPhone is nothing of a luxury item anymore. I mean, even here in China, the beggars have a smartphone, maybe not an iPhone. But in the case of Hong Kong, many of them really have difficulties, for instance, in terms of housing, in terms of upward mobility. What do you think is the problem in Hong Kong? In 10 seconds, if you can. Brendan.
Buying power across the world has gone down because costs have raised and our measurements of poverty have not kept up. Housing is more expensive. We need internet. We need a whole lot of things to actually survive and thrive in our world, and people do not have the incomes to meet those needs.
All right. It's a big topic that we veered into, but I have to leave it there. And maybe next time. Many thanks to Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer and Qiang here in Beijing. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Thanks for watching. You've got